Since the beginning of the so-called ceasefire, Israeli forces have killed 373 people and wounded 970 others in the Gaza Strip. Meanwhile, the month of October witnessed the most settler violence in the occupied Palestinian territories since 2006. Meanwhile, the Knesset approved preliminary plans for Israel to formally annex 82% of the West Bank. At the end of November, Israeli forces killed 13 people in Syria during a deadly raid that even Syria's new leadership denounced as a war crime. Syria is one of 7 countries across the Middle East and North Africa in which Israel has conducted military operations since the beginning of this year. Meanwhile, in Washington, the Trump administration plans to send a further $6 billion worth of arms to Tel Aviv. Closer to home, details of Britain's complicity in the erasure of the Palestinian people continue to surface. Declassified UK recently revealed that British soldiers have trained in Israel during the genocide. Such revelations fuel a broad-based mass solidarity movement which continues to mobilise in unprecedented numbers. While Donald Trump, fresh from receiving the FIFA Peace Prize, insists the second phase of his Gaza plan is close at hand, nation-states remain reluctant to man his proposed and vaguely defined international force. Only yesterday, the head of the Israeli army described the yellow line to which Israeli forces have withdrawn, splitting Gaza roughly in half, as a new borderline, exposing the colonial blueprint underpinning Trump's plan. My name is Coll McCail, I edit Scotia, and today is Tuesday, the 8th of December. To discuss the genocide in Palestine, its global consequences, and where next for the solidarity movement, I'm joined by Jonathon Shafi and Toufic Haddad. Jonathon is the co-chair of Stop the War Scotland, an editor at Conter and a columnist with The National. Toufic is a Palestinian academic and the author of Palestine Ltd, Neoliberalism and Nationalism in the Occupied Territories. He has worked in various capacities across the Occupied Palestinian Territories as a journalist, researcher, consultant, editor, and publisher. Let's get started. Toufic, let's start with the Gaza peace plan. In an article for the New Arab published in October, you argued that Trump's plans for Gaza and beyond resemble the desperate efforts of an empire in decline, sliding about on a bloody marble floor, barefoot. What did you mean?
Well, basically what I was getting at was that, and what people need to realize is that before October 7th, the major American plan for the region, Biden himself had basically announced, like not much more than a month before, a plan to basically link India with Israel, cutting across the Emirates, Saudi Arabia, Jordan to Israel. And the idea behind that plan was basically that the Americans, as the leader of the Western Bloc, was basically going to attempt to organize this kind of wedge of the globe politically and economically. They had suffered in recent years, particularly after Iraq and Afghanistan, and what they considered to be sort of Iranian sort of increased influence and what they used to call the Shiite crescent and all that kind of business. And they also had the crisis of the sort of Arab revolutionary waves that had taken place post 2011. And the West its project was kind of slipping in the region and losing influence with powerful regional players, particularly Iran. That was their biggest concern. In addition to that, they had the larger concern of the fact that Western productivity and share of GDP globally, the Western Bloc share, was losing and in decline in contrast to what the Chinese and the BRICS were up to, particularly the Chinese. And with the Chinese elaboration of the, Belt and Road Project and a maritime equivalent of that, which is called the String of Pearls, they were concerned with Chinese Western, quote unquote, encroachment. So the American plan was to try and organize this region with this India, Middle East, sort of Israel economic political partnership that was to sort of create a new trade and economic and political corridor that would organize their interests under kind of an American suzerainty, as you would call it in political speech. So basically, the events of October 7th and the genocide for the past 2 years threw a big, monkey wrench in that, because basically the people of the Arab world and the world broader, like, literally witnessed, the first, social media genocide happen, like on TikTok, and everyone was horrified. And that doesn't go well for, trying to advance that kind of project and Israeli normalization or America in the region and all that kind of thing. So when I published that article, I was basically sort of speaking to sort of Trump's, sort of his bombastic attempts to sort of pull a rabbit out of the hat and say, look, we got this mad, crazy, brilliant plan. Don't worry about it. Gaza's going to turn into this Riviera and whatever. And, we're all going to make a whole bunch of money and it's going to work. Now, of course, the first variant of that plan was like, yeah, let the Israelis like kick all the Gazans out. Now, and by the time I published that article, the plan is like, no, don't worry. Actually, Gaza's going to kind of hang around and, but still, like, question of Palestinian rights and say, and the whole thing is still, pretty obviously like, they're still going to be. This is all still theoretical, to be honest. This is their sort of pipe dreams, So I'm just sort of elaborating on this sort of, this stage of late Western capitalism where it's very obvious to your listeners and everyone who, is awake today that the political class is in crisis. The political center has kind of collapsed, and Gaza accelerated all these kinds of dynamics that are sort of very much revealing the chaos and the big mess that's out there.
At what point do you think US grand strategy for the region is resurrected? I mean, following things going wrong for the states in Iraq, Afghanistan, Iran, as you mentioned, at what point is this new strategy for the region conceptualized, and I suppose the vision of a US Middle East resurrected, or did it ever disappear?
So what are you asking about it?
I'm asking when you talked about the idea of a region that hinged upon an Indian, Israeli, American relationship. Where does that idea come from, and when do we begin to see it?
Well, I think the vision for that has, sort of existed for a while, because the Americans needed to answer the question of China. And, and that comes from the fact that, like I said, sort of, I think, what's his name? Wolf, the economist, basically said that, like, the American bloc or the Western bloc has like 28% of GDP globally, whereas the BRICS are at 36 right now. And that's actually significant, because basically what people don't realize is we had a situation from 1990 onwards where you had, they were declaring it was the end of history. The Western bloc won, Western capitalism won, neoliberalism was the end, whatever. And all of a sudden, now you have China. They used from 1990 the World Bank and the IMF as instruments of Western leverage, right, to basically rewrite and re-socially engineer and politically engineer the globe. Remember, all the protests of the last 20, 30 years were really actually about the anti-globalization movement, which was actually to try to sort of stand back. So where are those movements today? The point is, what I'm really pointing to is, like, if you were a country that was not aligned in the Western bloc, you had a crisis of liquidity or finance, or wanted a big project for your government, or wanted a big project funded, you didn't have many places to go. That's where the power of the World Bank and the IMF used to come from. Now you've got China. Now you've got other players who've like got dosh, and they're like, look, you don't have to do those political changes. You don't have to do those political reforms. We'll build you a dam. We'll build you this road or these bridges. We'll open it up. Just cut it this way or whatever. We'll give it to you faster, better, cheaper. And don't worry about the political problems that the Americans demand of you, privatization, etc. We'll cut you a better deal. And that's why it's a problem for the Western bloc, because there's competition for them. So that's as basically China and BRICS were able to form something that was potentially, it's only still potentially, I mean, America's still the main hegemon, let's not forget about it. But at the end of the day, they're losing competitiveness, and the writing's on the wall on those things. So particularly with Iraq and Afghanistan, and particularly with Iran, the Gulf was really worried about this, and the Americans were really worried about this, because like, that's like, when you control oil, like you control, oil is money, it's dosh. It's like there's 20-30 trillion dollars worth of natural gas that's coming out of little baby Emirates that have 500,000 people in them. You understand? Like locals, a bunch of feudal, basically families and extended families like that the Brits set up in the back in the day. So that area and that excess cash, what they call rent, that money. I mean, one day oil is $50 a barrel. One day it's 200. There's no extra labor that goes in to do that. That extra $150 that you get, you got to make sure that you control that. And that extra $150, that's the big hidden secret of Western capitalism. That's what goes and floats the dollar and the pound and the Western real estate market and the bonds and the companies. That's what keeps it solvent and buoyant. Now, if that money is in the hands of your competitors or under the political influence of competitors, you have a big problem. So, and particularly after Iraq happened, where Iran was seen to have been one of the political winners of that. And in addition to that, the Gulf states themselves had questions of succession, big succession questions, particularly Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is a particularly important player because it's the swing oil producer. When you need to, when, you know, if you have a crisis of oil that's in the market, you know, to be, not anybody can just come out of and pump out an additional 5 million barrels of oil for the world market to keep prices down. Saudi Arabia can do that. It has that capacity. So that player needs to be safe. And Saudi was uber nervous, and the Americans were uber nervous about Saudi because they had big succession problem potentials that were coming up when the sort of the old guard or the old leadership was going, and you had all these, you know, potential emirs who had succession claims on the thing. So the American, plus they were also spending money like nuts all over the place and whatever. And so the Americans had been working with, like, for instance, the McKinsey consultancy corporation produced a plan for like the Saudis, the Saudis did it supposedly, but it's McKinsey, the Americans who did, basically for a post-oil economy, because like, that's a big country. It's got a lot of territory. It's got a lot of wealth. You got to keep that on side, so to speak. So basically, they were coming up with these plans, and so they packaged this all together. Exactly when, I don't have a particular date, but it's something that emerges out of different fears and different needs and different losses of traction and position that the West has, and their players in the West also have.
Jonathon, I'll bring you in. You wrote an article for Tribune actually not so long ago entitled "Israel in the Cold," in which you focused on the fraying relationship between Israel and Washington. I wonder how you think that relationship fits into the regional dynamic that Toufic is outlining.
Yeah, well, I think the analysis that we've just heard is, in many ways, there are areas where they're kind of interlocked with the article that I'd written in Tribune. Yeah, I think the place to start with this in some ways is, what's the relationship between the United States and Israel? What's the relationship based on? Why and how does it exist? And there are some kind of competing theories about this. And one of the kind of popular theories, particularly on social media, particularly in the United States, by the way, popularized by people like Tucker Carlson, right, is that the United States wouldn't be embroiled in all these wars, wouldn't be embroiled in the genocide in Gaza, had it not been for the nefarious influence of the Israel lobby, right? Now, clearly, the Israel lobby, is influential. There are a whole number of influential political lobbies in the United States. But my analysis has always been, and is still, that the relationship functions in the opposite direction. That historically, Israel has been a base in the Middle East to extend American interests, and by extension to extend the interests of the British state and other European capitals. The question comes about how the world system is changing and restructuring. Does it alter the relationship, right? And the West as a kind of geopolitical coherent idea is beginning to break down. So I don't know if you read the national security strategy published by the Trump administration over the last couple of days, where it basically identifies Europe as a threat rather than as an ally. It talks about all sorts of things to do with which are very undermining of Europe, right? They're very provocative of Europe, and looking towards subordinating Europe in many ways. And so, if there is an emerging multipolar order, and you just talked about BRICS and so on, what does that mean for the region? One thing it might mean is that the idea of the Israeli state playing this kind of watchdog role, this kind of role which is belligerent, that's based on destabilization, the imperial idea of destabilizing the Middle East through wars in Iraq, Afghanistan, the forever war model, etc. If that's coming to a close because it's no longer viable, then how does that translate into the region? And there's all sorts of open questions. But I suppose I'm trying to think of a way of, I'd be interested in your view of this, right? I'm trying to think of a way of conceptualizing that process, because it seems to me that you look at the massive deals going on between the Gulf and the United States. We're talking about trillions of dollars of investment. You look at the way in which, I'll give you an example of something which is, is very interesting to me. Mamdani in the White House, right? And he stands there and he's asked about Gaza, and is Gaza a genocide? And Mamdani says, yes, it's a genocide. And Trump's sort of looking up at him, just sort of like nodding away in a way. Do you know what I mean? And then publishing all these great photographs of him and Mamdani. That is an important kind of dynamic which is opening up here. So I suppose where I'll end this is, you talked about this idea of the monkey wrench in terms of normalization. It does seem to me that players in the region have understood that Israel's position has been eroded as a result of the genocide. Okay, there have been military victories that they might point to in terms of, they could go into all of that. But actually, their standing in their position, I think, has eroded. And what that means is that the concept of normalization then hinges on a number of trade-offs, right? And I think that's now what we're entering that phase. What is the nature of those trade-offs? Because I don't think there's just going to be straightforward normalization with Israel. That's my idea, and not my idea, but that's one way of looking at it, I suppose.
I'll bring you in, Toufic, but I'm interested as well in your answer as to whether you think it is true that the position of Israel within the region has been weakened over the last 2 years, given the collapse of the Assad regime in Syria, given the extent to which the state of Israel has been allowed to bomb countries across the region while continuing to receive those checks from Washington, given the given the extent to which material support has not necessarily been limited in any obvious way from the West. Do you think that's accurate to say that position has weakened?
To answer that is, in whose eyes? If it's in the eyes of the state and of the West and the Western Bloc, absolutely not. It's been elevated. But it's a problem. But that doesn't mean it's without its problems, because it's very clear that everybody watched this horrific genocide basically perpetuated by a kind of psychopathy and a sociopathic state, that, dresses up in, women's underwear after they loot it and just wanton destruction for whatever, and with her, everything about it that we saw that was so horrific, that's a problem. If you're the West, one of their big cards was that, Israel is an ally and we're liberals and we're better than the barbarians, right? When Israel is actually broadcasting that it's like, simply doesn't care, basically.
And
right?
yet it's doing so under the guise of civilizational warfare.
Whatever. But so that's the point. Like, the point is, Israel's standing actually hasn't gone down. They need it more than ever. It's their only horse. It's their horse in this game. They don't have another card. They can't bet on a local regime. They're like, because they're all autocrats. They're all dictators. On a day and a night, they can be chucked. They can be overthrown in a military coup. Their people can rise up, like what happened to Mubarak, like what happened to Ben Ali, like what happened to Gaddafi, like what happened to whatever. They're not reliable. Israel is organically linked to them. And Israel, its economic and political orientation has always been to the West. And the West, played a key role in, funding and developing that military and making sure that all those weapons were American weapons, basically, with their stamp on it, basically. So, in addition, they need Israel to perform what it needs to perform, to keep the Arab world down, to keep the people down, to keep the governments down, to keep the Iranians out, to keep the potential gas reserves in the area, like to start that feeding Europe, to help Europe, wean itself away from the gas that it was getting and the leverage and that Russia had over, Europe, because they had those cold winters and all that business. So they didn't have another option. But but at the end of the day, Israel was, like I said, this sort of sociopathic power, because it's motivated and driven by this Zionist Jewish supremacist ideology that has different varieties within it, but the governing character of this particular government coalition is, everything. It's messianic, it's Jewish supremacist, it's fascistic, it's neo-Nazi-like. That was something you could say before. Actually, that was something Israeli commentators were commenting about. So we know this. So and I'm not saying it just to say, but when that's your only, that's who you need to rely upon, and then they start going after you empower them and give them $27 billion and all the best weapons and the best airplanes to go bomb and do whatever they do, and they do what they do, and then they take pictures of it, and nobody holds them account to it. It creates a problem. And that eventually the West now had to somehow pull the plug on it, because those guys were going for, it's time for a greater Israel now, whatever. They were speaking very openly about it. Smotrich was, speaking at conferences with Israel and Jordan, like on a map, like in front of him. Jordan is a key Western ally. It's like the British set up that state, and all of a sudden the Israelis are talking about taking over. Netanyahu goes to conferences talking about greater Israel, and literally it takes out all the way, shows a map that goes all the way to Kuwait. They start bombing Qatar to try and kill, the Hamas representatives, whatever, just before. And it was all the Americans had asked. The Americans have the largest base in Qatar. The Americans had asked Qatar to negotiate the things. The Americans had asked Qatar to give Hamas a place to be there, headquartered there. And then on top of that, the Israelis bomb them. So they needed to rein the Israelis in, and that's where we're at right now.
That's basically what the Gaza peace plan is.
That's what the ceasefire is. That's what the ceasefire is, because I think the Arab and Western world was like, look, rein in your attack dog here. Whatever. We're not going to let them go greater Israel. What do you expect? We've given you everything. We gave you military bases. We supported you. We arrested any Palestine protests. The Arab world didn't have a major protests in it. The protests were here in the West, right? And on top of that, you bomb us and whatever. Our people already watched this genocide the last 2 years. We know they're at a breaking point. Either they're going to start coming after us, or they're going to come after you. And we're not going to let them come after us, because, sorry, whatever. We did everything for you, and this is how you treated us. So that's what we witness in the turn of Trump right now. He pulled the plug on the Greater Israel project that Netanyahu and his coalition were leading. He set up a base in southern Israel to oversee the ceasefire arrangement. He took control of the border. The Israelis don't control the border anymore, and they allow whatever they allow in, And we're going to see how this plays out. There's a lot of problems there. Today, yesterday, The Guardian talked about how the Israelis are spying on the Americans in the base, etc. It shows the high degree of distrust that exists there. But at the same time, the Americans still need the Israelis. Netanyahu is still the kingpin in Israel. There's not a viable Israeli leader because Netanyahu also used the genocide to take out as much of his political opposition as well. And he's on a mission himself to take over the state of Israel through wars of position against his ex-enemies. And he's talking about the deep state in Israel, which is basically the ex-Ashkenazi elite, which had set up the state. And he represents a different constituency. So there's a lot of moving parts that are going on here.
Yeah, I think that when you get towards the end of that bit of analysis there's the whole question of Netanyahu. And to me, there's a contradiction happening. I think that the objectives of American foreign policy in the region have moved into a post-Netanyahu era, on the one hand. But on the other hand, there is no obvious replacement for Netanyahu, no obvious political opposition to Netanyahu, right? That, I think, is a contradiction which is quite damaging and which is exacerbating tensions between the United States and Israel, right? If you think about the attack on Doha, the Israeli strike on Doha, that also reinforces one of the points I think you're making there, which is about this has become such an unstable state of affairs that it's not just people in Gaza, who, by the way, are completely dispensable, not only to the Americans and to the Israelis, but to the Gulf regimes, right?
And to the
as long as it doesn't impact their own leadership, as long as it doesn't lead to rebellion in their own streets, right? But that's the way they look at it. They're not looking at it from the point of view of, some moral position about stopping the genocide, right? So the question then comes is, what is it if we think to ourselves that the idea of the forever war model, to use that language, right, is unsustainable, right, and that we're in this kind of multipolar era, then the question of regional stability comes onto the table, right? And the question of the United States staking out its interests through commercial collaboration rather than through wars and occupation comes onto the table as well, right? And so I think that it's true to say, I would agree with you, I think it's true to say that the Americans can't rely on, for example, the Saudis and the Saudi leadership for the reasons you talked about. I also don't think they can rely on the model that they had been working with Israel on over the last number of decades, right? There is a transition taking place in some sense, right? How it exactly happens, we're not going to know until we see it, right? But this ceasefire, if we put that in inverted commas, because they're killing Palestinians every day, but the point is to basically say that the complete ethnic cleansing of Gaza is something that's not going to be tolerated. And at that point, I think the Israeli state's in a real problematic position, because otherwise, what have they been doing in Gaza, right? What's actually been accomplished there, right? My last point, and I'd be interested in your view on this as well, is there are certain strategic objectives which seem to align between the United States and some of these Gulf states and the Saudi leadership and so on, which is that if the Saudis are interested in regional stability for commercial reasons and not having constant wars, constant conflict and so on, then from their perspective, they want to see the demise of militancy, of militant organizations. And I think they understand that those militant organizations, to use again that kind of language, they're a product of the Israeli occupation. They're a product of the oppression of the Palestinians. And so I think they see this kind of this twin project of trying to disarm, in a sense, both quote unquote sides within that context, as a means to pursue regional stability. Now, I appreciate there's a lot of assumptions in there, some big claims in there, but I suppose I'm just trying to open up a discussion about there is a transition taking place in the world system. What's the impact in the region? And does it look different to what we classically understand the US-Israel relationship and strategy to look like? That's my question, I suppose.
And I'll bring you back in, Toufic, but I suppose as part of that, I'm interested in the extent to which we can actually see this transition taking place in the region, and if it is the case that the Middle East is multipolar at this stage, given that we've just talked about the number of regimes who have allowed the US and Israel carte blanche over the last 2 years, given the IMF in Syria over the last month, negotiating structural adjustment in the country. Is it the case that the US is stronger in the Middle East than it has been at any point for a considerable amount of time? I suppose the Abraham Accords in 2020, another example of 3 more Arab states normalizing relations, more than that, 5. Is this transition to multipolarity visible in the Middle East, or is the US still the regional hegemon?
Yeah, it's still the regional hegemon, but it's not. But it's more complicated than that. It's not that the West has dominance in the region. It's not. It has bases, etc. But look, you had an important Pan-Arab project. They set up states. What? It's not that each state was doing what America wanted all over the place. Broadly speaking, the West was interested and was organizing the region with making Israel the supreme power with the best weapons and monitoring on an intelligence level and slapping down anyone who really raised their head, whether it was government or non-government actor, and then having also bilateral alliances with any state that was willing to go its direction. Of course, the key ones are the Gulf, which those need to be in alignment because they don't really have militaries. They can't fight. They can't. They're highly dependent upon somebody who can back them up because they're in a busy neighborhood with big neighbors around who might want to take advantage of them, like Iraq or Iran or whatever. So the Gulf needs to be protected. So, it was the Brits who were doing that, and the Americans sort of took over that role after 1990. But then you had states, the big states, like Egypt, which was trying its own thing, but then breaks towards the U.S. after Camp David in 1979. But then you also had other projects that were trying to do other things, like the Arab republics, Syria, Libya, Sudan, etc. Now, the problem is the Arab republics all broke down in the last, their projects failed, and they had big democracy deficits. Economically they were no longer viable, and we saw the revolutions that came out in the 2011 to 2012 period. And the folks who were waiting in the wings, or who the only real political opposition who could take over there, was the Islamists. Now, that was a big problem because if the Islamists sort of take over, then all of a sudden, this thing could spread. It could they don't know which direction. It has a lot of political things around it that, that around Israel, around a whole bunch of things. So in any case, to answer the question, America after the revolutions, basically, this is what the project was about: pushing back the regional players like Turkey and Iran, basically, lifting up Israel, so give them a whole bunch of weapons, keeping the Chinese out of the region so they don't go there, bringing the Indians in to wedge the Chinese out, and basically make India your producer with Gulf capital, and Israel would be the watchdog of the whole region. And what we witnessed during the Gaza war is Israel's sphere of security, that security between quotations, all of a sudden moved from the basic Levant. Now they're bombing Sudan. Now they're bombing, Yemen. Now they're patrolling seas in the Arabian Sea. Now they're hitting Iran. That's a huge geography. That was not what Israel's role was historically. Okay, so we see that expansion. So that's a pretty big green light, but the problem is Israel and America have different interests. They do have, like I said, because the character of the things. But fundamentally, there's a fair amount of overlap there. So let's just make sure that it's the West that's overlapping the other one, or not not who's setting the agenda here. So I don't see multipolarity here taking place. I see an imperfect, the best that they can do. The West doesn't, Trump doesn't mind it, what he's saying, because that's part of his psychopolitics and whatever. He doesn't have to have ideological or political integrity to either his administration or his politics, but he's doing his best, whatever. He didn't actually come up with the policies. He gave it to, whatever, aspects of the deep state and the Zionists and, whatever, The Europeans are less comfortable with it because it's like their liberalism still didn't entirely collapse, basically, and they pay a bigger price, and so it's more uncomfortable for them to be seen as they're liable and certain legalistically amongst each other and things like that. The Americans don't have the same sort of things, and so anyway, I don't see that. But it's an imperfect system, but it's one that whatever if they don't do it. And if they don't back Israel, somebody else might get in there, and they play a realpolitik game here. Winner takes all.
I was just going to say, I think that response to my kind of what is at this point just like a provocation of thinking about the region and thinking about the state of American power within it. I think there's a lot that's very clarifying in what you just said. But it does raise a question for me, which I wanted to get your view of. How do you see the position of Iran at the present moment within the region? And what was your interpretation of the exchange between Iran and Israel and the eventual bombing of the mountain, famously, and so on? How did you look at that, I guess?
Yeah, they wanted to put back Iran in its place and hopefully collapse the regime, or at least significantly weaken it. The nuclear question is a major important one, because if Iran or anyone has a nuclear weapon that, other than Israel, they can blackmail, and that's basically what it's about. And so Iran needed to be pushed back, and Iran had stepped into the shadow in this political space that had been opened up in the failure and in the absence of an Arab project. So basically, ever since Egypt left the Arab-Israeli conflict and willingly surrendered trying to lead a kind of Arab independent agenda, whether it's pan-Arabist or whatnot, and basically said, we'll go with the West and set up their own sort of rent scheme, and the military is just going to dominate, and we're not going to play big, scary third world politics with anybody. Just give us your weapons. And for 40 years, the Egyptian military has just been taking a whole bunch of weapons from the West, and, and who knows, where it's going. It can be as corrupt as it wants. It doesn't matter. They still keep on backing it because that's still the Suez Canal. So in the absence of an Arab project led by the biggest country or anyone, whatever, Iran stepped in that space, basically. And so they were clever in building influence by supporting things like Palestine, and then supporting, sort of other movements that had been oppressed or had to put down, like the Shia in Iraq and whatever they did in Yemen. And and they were building political influence across the region, also with Hezbollah, of course, and whatnot. So, but fundamentally, that space was only because there was no Arab project going on there. So Iran and the U.S., put that back in its place, I think, right now, and they were quite effective in that, to be honest. And the counter to that, the backup plan, which links to the things that I was talking about before, is basically they don't want powerful states whatever, whether it's Libya or Sudan or Syria or whatever. I don't say those states because I like them, but they were republics. They were trying to do something they believed in sovereign countries. They believed, Syria was producing things. It was like agricultural. It was trying to produce weapons. It was whatever it was freaking doing. But, in the end, it turned into a narco state. But I'm not going to, but the point is, they much more prefer, they don't want a state that can actually play that game anymore. From their perspective, they prefer to federalize Syria or break down the ability of these states are products of post-World War II. Yeah. They're like the Arab world. They want break that shit down. The Israelis always had this idea that the Middle East is a mosaic. That's why they always emphasize minorities in the Middle East and the Sunni and the Shia and the Kurds and the Yemenite and all this sort of sub-identities. Because within that sphere, you can create basically forms of sectarianism and Lebanonization of the entire Arab world. And then you just create a bunch of rotten elites that are funded through Arab Gulf money. And then you have your little playground. Then the Arab world, that geostrategic region is sort of controlled under your thing. But if you have states who are trying to do independent projects, that's another story. So those debates are still going on.
Interesting. Very interesting. I suppose I would like to pivot the conversation now towards implications of the genocide for the world order more generally out with the region, to the extent that it ever existed, and it didn't. The rules-based international order has come unraveled in Gaza. I wonder, given you could take a whole raft of international institutions established during the post-war period, be it the International Criminal Court, the Chief Justice of whom now faces sanctions within the United States, be it the UN Special Rapporteur mandates, again, Francesca Albanese facing sanctions from the United States. I suppose I'm interested in what comes next in the event that these institutions, their credibility, again, systematically and gradually weakened over the course of the 70 years in which they have existed, but particularly in an intensified manner in the last 2 years. What comes next, particularly when it comes to the question of accountability and attempting to ensure that some justice is done? Jonathon?
Accountability is something that we've talked about a lot, for numerous reasons. First of all, justice, some portion of justice, right? That everyone who's been involved in the genocide has to be held accountable. Second, because if you don't do that, not only is there no even partial justice for the people at the receiving end of the genocide in Gaza, but it opens the door, it passes the Rubicon into a world where this is acceptable, or if not acceptable, is something that can happen without it eventuating in any real downside for the people who are perpetrating it, because all that matters is raw power. All that matters is that kind of dynamic. And that's the kind of world that we are in a more vivid way moving into. Because it was already very vivid if you were in Iraq, already very vivid if you're in Palestine, right? Or many other countries. What's beginning to happen is this is sort of reflecting back into the West in a much bigger way, I think, than before. And Gaza's been a big part of that, right? The way in which Gaza has been interpreted back into the West, the way it has affected populations in the West, the way it has undermined the so-called system of values, which is associated with the West, wrongly associated with the West. And no one else, but you realise that no one else in the world has got any value system that's worth looking at, right? Only the West. So there's been a lot of undermining and eroding of that. And you see, this overlaps with, just go back to national security strategy for a second. The US is basically saying very explicitly they want the EU broken up, right? They're basically saying, we don't want Europe to be an independent economic and political bloc. We want complete subjugation of Europe under the United States. And my view of that is because the United States is transitioning from outright unrivaled global hegemon into a regional hegemon, in which there's going to be more focus on Europe. You look at the CIA, how it repurposed, and one of the quotes that come out from the coverage of this was that it was refocusing on what were traditional allies, right? So you get all this discourse about Denmark and Canada and Greenland and all that, but you also get it about Venezuela. And you also get, I think, an increasing move towards the complete subjugation of South America as part of this process. And within that, all of the institutions which were meant to define the liberal rules-based order have broken down, been obliterated, are now sort of been shoved into a ditch by the states who, in the first place, set them up. So I'll just end by saying this, like, we know that the International Criminal Court is an imperial court, right? We know that its job is not to go and say, sorry, but, you know, Donald Rumsfeld should probably have been tried for war crimes, right? For example, right? We know that's the case. But, you know, we also know that the visualization of there being some kind of order around which the West, which was a geopolitical coherent bloc, is completely eroding. It's unraveling in front of us, right? So this is like a massive change to the world system, and I'm not sure how it filters its way through. Right, we've just had the discussion, which I think is actually a very complex discussion about how it filters through to the Middle East, right? Which I certainly feel I've learned from you, Toufic, right? But this is a system which is radically changing. And I think Gaza has been central to that whole process, by the way. The way in which that has contoured that discussion and that framework has been, I think, pivotal.
Henry Kissinger used to talk about waging war in the grey areas. I suppose those grey areas don't exist in the age of live-streamed genocide. Is the West breaking down as a geopolitically coherent bloc, Toufic?
Well, things are happening, and certainly there are tensions going on. I mean, what people need to realize is that the international rules-based order, you know, which is supposedly breaking down, and which Gaza has sort of very much unmasked as, you know, you have a, you know, live stream genocide, and they can't, you know, and they're actually going after the UN person who's saying that, you know, and putting them under sanctions. I mean, what's going on here, right? The very people who in states that built this system are actively undermining it. So that's a big question that's going on there. And I think what folks need to realize is that that system was a product of World War II, right? The Allies defeated Nazism, right? The Axis or whatever. And like, but that was a bloody confrontation. Like, you know, 60 million people died, 27 million Russians died to like basically defeat Nazism, right? It wasn't really America and the Brits who actually did that too, by the way. So when they came up with the international rules-based order, they needed to account for Stalin and the Russians and the others, right? So they came up with the Security Council, and they came up with the system, imperfect as it was, and wrote up their sort of utopian sort of, you know, sheet for how the world would work according to rules and international law, etc. Now, we know that was always problematic. We know even many of the countries who wrote that up were still imperial or, you know, colonizing states and whatnot. But basically, when 1990 happened, or when the Soviet Union collapses, like, you don't have that. You don't have to play game with somebody. You don't have to really be compromising. You actually use the system for lock-in, you know? And that's what happened. They tried to lock in their thing. And that's why the World Bank and the IMF and, you know, unipolar hegemony happened. But then the system, then they start propagating what? Neoliberalism. There is no alternative. All this business, right? Like end of the world, whatever, you know, Thomas Friedman crap, whatever.
The world will be flat.
Exactly. And then, but then what happens? Then the world economy goes off a cliff because it's unhinged hyper-capitalism that, if market forces had been left to their own devices, would have been a crash much worse than 1929, right? So, and then it's like, okay, so and that's important. because ideologically liberalism collapsed. There was no theory behind what was going on. Okay, so that explains the guts, the center of why the huge vacuum that happened. People didn't realize it at the time. They said, oh, it's a big economic collapse. Okay, all right, but don't worry, we'll fix it. But actually, if the market forces happened, the banks would have collapsed, the real estate market would have collapsed, everybody would be homeless, there'd be no jobs, there would be production. That's what the world would have looked like if market forces if they had gone by the theory. Instead, what happened is they did a patch-up job, and they faked it, and some banks failed, and other banks were allowed to survive. That was a political choice. That was to do with insiders who decided that, and predictions. And so if it was really about insiderism and not about liberalism and markets and competition, then a different game was actually really being played. Okay, so that explains why the political sphere begins to, polarize so extensively, and the collapse of the liberal center all across the board basically begins to happen. And and so this is why, and eventually you get to a stage where somebody like Trump, who's a predatory vulture capitalist, businessman who donated to Republicans and Democrats, and pedophile probably, or whatever, he doesn't care. He takes over the imperial throne. I mean, what the hell? It's saying something basically. So, Europe is, what was the question again?
I was just thinking, I mean, it was about you. You've answered it, and you've answered it very well. And it made me think that the point that you made about the extent to which the institutions of the rules-based international order are used under unipolarity reminded me of the fact that, of course, the sanctions against Saddam were enforced by the UN. They weren't enforced by the US directly. Sanctions which Madeleine Albright acknowledges kill 500,000 children are imposed by the UN, which I suppose begs the question about the extent to which any of what we are seeing now is unprecedented.
Right. There always were attempts by the South to use the UN system and international law to win their rights, and there were, to some degree, some achievements in that. Let's be honest about that. And especially when the world looked different. Let's not forget there was a whole UN resolution that said Zionism is racism. In 1973 with South Africa, huge important resolutions that basically said, look, this is an apartheid state, don't deal with it. And actually, there's a few guilty parties who do deal with it. The Zionist movement, Israel, and fascist Portugal. They were explicit about it in the 1973 resolution. So the Global South was using the UN system to try and fight back. But after 1990, that's a whole nother story, and the West, because America sort of attempts to reorganize the West according to its vision of things. And then the story of what I said comes out. But the final part of the story is actually is really like, do we wait? Are we waiting to re-put this system back in order? It's not going to happen.
Not gonna happen.
It was a big-ass fucking war, bloody 60 million to get it to the crappy system that we had before. So that leaves the question for us, for the readers, for the listeners. We're not really, don't expect this to be put Humpty Dumpty be put back in place, right? It's actually up to us. That's the point. That's what I'm going around trying to say, because we saw the genocide the last 2 years, but since the ceasefire, last 2 months, you see airline companies coming back to Israel. We see Germany going to Israel right now, sending them arms again. The Israeli weapons factories going back. Getting it off the front page, the genocide, and now slowly but surely, Israel is slowly but surely, they're attempting to normalize it, desensationalize the thing, sort of isolate, freeze, quiet down, etc. It's very obvious off the BBC, and in fact, they're going after their enemies. The BBC is the problem now in this country, right? It's a right-wing attack on the BBC. It's not like the BBC was complicit in, it didn't do anything to show anything about Gaza or whatever, but they couldn't even tolerate minimal, deformed liberal discourse that allowed, Palestinians to have an opinion or to be even a real victim. It was incredible what we saw in the genocide. So the point is, we need to be the force that holds people to account, that rebuilds that system. And we're not ready for it. That's the point. That's what, like, we're not like, I mean, because we were all drunk. The West was drunk on that neoliberalism. They still believe neoliberalism can come back. They sold us a lot of dreams. And there were a lot of advances that took place under neoliberalism too. Like our grandparents, the great generation after World War II, like the life we live today is a lot better than that in principle. It should be. But you see, you know, so people believe in the, like, you know, mortgages and all this stuff. You can still get credit. You can have all this great hair products. You can, you know, sit in your house and sit on an internet and travel the world and have the best sex and whatever, right? Like you can that is very tempting because capitalism showed us, neoliberalism showed us glimpses of a utopia. And like, but the reality of production, of labor relations, of the imperial systems, the geopolitics that underrode that system and what's really going on, that's what we can't really figure out. And Gaza very much showed it, accelerated the demasking, the unmasking of this situation, also exposed our own disorganization, basically, and that we're unable to stand up for, at least to even defend minimal things like civil rights and free speech and, you know, right to protest. I mean, they did a complete piss take. It took major sacrifices to win things like academic freedom or free speech or right to protest. In a day and a night, they took that away. You know, and they come up with, you know, terrorism laws for Palestine action or whatever, you know, like, in any case, the point is, we're in a situation where it's up to us, basically. The more we're organized, the more we know what this is about, the more we realize this is a war of position and of movement, the more we will be able to stand up and expose and win back and defend, because they're actually coming for this state. They're coming for all of our things. They don't believe in democracy anymore, right? Like, it's pretty damn obvious, like, you know?
Yeah.
Anyway, I don't want to keep on.
I think that's a very good note to end on. And I suppose the only question left to ask is, given the constraints on our rights, how do we use the little agency that we have? How should we use it? Jonathan?
I mean, just quickly, I think, you know, this idea that there is going to be this restructuring, this dismantling of the world order as we've known it is irreversible, right? We're moving into something different, and you can't arrest that process. Doesn't matter who's elected president, for example. These are structurally embedded processes now at work. And I think that I just want to, I guess, underline one of the points that you just made there, which was that we can only rely on ourselves, on our own organisation, our own movements, our own institutions that we develop. And that's difficult work, but it's really our only option. No one else is going to deliver justice. No one else is going to deliver the kind of world that we all want to see. And so when it comes to, just to bring it back to for me to just conclude on Gaza, when it comes to Gaza, you know, there is going to be an attempt, there already is an attempt to memory hole it. There's already in some sections this idea, oh, are you still talking about that? I thought we were finished with that, because it's kind of distasteful to talk about it, right? You know, we know that was bad, but, you know, let's stop talking about it and move on. There's other issues that you need to talk about, right? And we need to resist that. We need to really forcefully and firmly resist that idea, right? That's the power of ideology. And the way we confront that is through the idea of building a mass movement. And those demonstrations that we've all been part of, all of the tapestry of organisations that have been doing things at a local level, at a national level, next year need to be absolutely revitalised. We need to be on the streets in as big as numbers as we ever have been. We need to expand the number of people that we're talking to. And the reason that we should have some grounds for optimism that our organising makes an impact is because the establishment is relying on, the state is relying on draconian measures to shut us down. Whether it is Palestine action protesters, but you know, you got vicars being arrested for holding up signs, right? Or whether it is people being smeared and defamed, right, for simply standing up for human rights, for simply standing against genocide. And I will say this: the coalition that we've all been part of, it's multi-faith, it's multiracial, it's from all parts of society, it's a cross section of the public. It's powerful, when you have a movement that is morally defined, but can also understand that political action is needed to back that up. That's what I think we need to develop, we need to maintain over the next while.
Yeah, I mean, it's a bit, what we've outlined are huge historical forces.
Yeah.
And the truth is, we don't know where they're going to head to. The cookie's crumbling. You have a very clear rise of a neo-fascism, an anti-democratic, authoritarianism push that's leading towards militarism and war, that actually would make money out of it. With Gaza and the Gaza genocide, just a microcosm. Imagine if those aspects are actually generalized in 5 or 10 years, and like those technologies of surveillance and all and profit making can go to so many different arenas around the world. By the way, you could see major World War IIIs. I mean, taking place. On the other hand, we already have, I think it's important to see things historically, right? Like, it took a long time to build what we have. Parliamentary democracy, where it exists, is actually it's true, it's bourgeois democracy,
but it's a concession.
But it's a concession, but also it's contradictory, right? It's not entirely, what I would say is basically we need to advocate for the expansion of democracy. And it's not, these parliaments are important advances towards, in the face of monarchies, of course, but they're not socialism, or they're not equality, or they're not, right? They're still not delivering for most people as they should. Now, then the question is, so what do we do in the context of these larger forces that we're talking about? I would basically advocate that we don't have an option but to basically operate within parliamentary means as well as in extra parliamentary means. We don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater with our parliaments, because actually they're important. They're still holding on to certain, in principle, we have a right to vote. In principle, we can expand certain political and social rights, and things, things shouldn't be done in our name that are not what we want. And the Gaza genocide showed that. And, but the problem is that, our elites, did a piss take in things like Iraq and in Gaza, where they actually went against the will. They were anti-democratic, right? Okay. So on one level, our parliamentary systems are problematic and deformed and have major problems in them. So something serious needs to be reformed or fixed there. On the other hand, you also have, I would argue, extra parliamentary means, which have historically been the tools for actually advancing rights and through social movements. And here I think that the key driver, the key, area where change, of course, protests are really important, but we don't want to be in the situation like what happened in Iraq, where we had the largest protests in world history, but they still destroyed a country and they still went after it. So here, what we need to understand is, where do we actually get the leverage? Where does it stick? Where does where does it make a difference, right? And that's, I think, the missing ingredient here, to be very frank about it, is things like the working class, is actually labor, organized labor. And it's not by chance that what happened in Gaza, they pulled the plug on Gaza when Italy called the general strike, when Barcelona said they were about to go, because you had the working class within Southern Europe linking Palestine and Gaza to working class issues of average folks in Italy or in Greece or in Spain. And then all of a sudden capital was like, okay, wait, be careful here. Yeah, it's not because they've started seeing a genocide. The genocide was seen. It was that, and the point here, what's the difference here? It's not me and, waxing pontifical about being a Marxist or whatever. It's that actually, if you stop labor, you stop the system, right? That's different. It's different than a moral claim. Please stop, politician. Here's a letter to my MP or whatever. No, it's like the system, your system of profiteering is going to stop because we're organized to stop it. We are going through direct, and then there's labor, and then there's also direct action, which is another way to stop the thing. So I think we need to study the different tools of extra parliamentary means to actually block and stop and to change the system, but we can't also abandon the system itself. And things like Mamdani and things like that are actually important testaments to efforts to try and use the system. Now, who knows where that effort's going to go, but we can definitely say I mean, he defeated the Republicans and sort of, the right-wing Democrats and who knows how many mafias in New York just to get to that position. And he shows, he clearly got to a stage where a new level of struggle is going to have to happen. A new, and that needs to happen in every theater across the board, on the local, national, and international levels. That process needs to take place by thinking, active agents who are self-conscious, who have principles of justice and equality, and that are really with them. Because the alternative is also really scary. A world where the Gaza genocide and what was unleashed there are generalized and universalized and become profitable. And Elon Musk and Peter Thiel become the, eugenic leaders of the world, like running this place from Mars, and we're a bunch of slaves and who knows what, I mean, that's the freaky world that they're basically, proposing to us, and it's, through, and different elites of different orders, different pathetic orders, from Keir Starmer and Gulfi sheikhs and Netanyahu and who knows what other freaks are running the place, and, we have a world to win, but it's up to us to organize.